Alright, welcome back to Fractures and Other Bony Stuff, Part 2, I guess. We left off on the, I guess it was the commutated and compression fractures, and we'll pick back up on the last 2 or 3, and then get into bones of the skull specifically. And hopefully be able to wrap this all up in a nice package of 24 minutes or less. Oh God, stop. Kevin. Stop. You saw a squirrel. It's not going to do anything with it. Anyway, so the image that I'd like to pick back up on is in your common types of fractures. Pick up on slide number 5, that is. Common types of fractures, the spiral. Talked about it the previous lecture with respect to sports injuries, and these do require typically internal fixation of some sort, a plate with some screws in it, or a pin, as they call it, a little bar that goes in and puts everything back together and holds it there while you heal. That will leave a significant scar on the bone. Significant calcium deposits will follow, and the actual metal that they use, the pieces that they put in you, are serial numbered and traceable. So they are great, absolute, unequivocal identifiers of the person, if that person does eventually end up as a skeleton and discovered. So spiral, lots of problems. The next one I want to spend a more significant amount of time on, this is the epiphysial. And the epiphysial is it looks like it's a super problematic break, and it kind of is. The epiphysial goes back to our previous maybe 4 lectures ago, when I talked about epiphysial unions. Near the ends of long bones, where you have a head connected to a neck, or a head connected to the ramus itself, like in your humerus or in your femur. The epiphysial union is that cartilaginous little zone that slowly, gradually ossifies or turns to calcium hard bone over time, over set years. And we call them your growth plates. When you have a fracture at a growth plate, I had already mentioned, it doesn't cause any change in your growth rates or anything like that, previous wives' tale aside, but they are relatively easy spots to pop, because there's a density differential there, and if enough stress is applied where the bone's going to bend and give before it's going to break, if there is a nice little slab of butter in there, a cartilaginous zone, that's where you're going to get that force eliminated. It's going to equalize by separating. So an epiphysial fracture, super easy to see on the X-ray, and it surprisingly doesn't necessarily require internal fixation or pinning. You can set that bone, get it back into place using a fluoroscope, where an incision is not absolutely necessary. It's like a real live time X-ray that the surgeon can reset that bone without having to cut you open. And if external fixation, cast and bed rest can be achieved, that can heal reasonably well without a lot of shit. Not a lot of work. God, this bothers me when this happens. All right, so you're gonna pause for a sec, because sometimes my tripod pops. Hold on. All right. Sorry. Anywho, let me get this realigned. That's decent. Okay. So, epiphysial. We're going to go through this again. hang on. This is where, we're experiencing technical difficulties. You've got homemade equipment because of the pandemic. Got homemade equipment, you can't really rely on it being, awesome. Anyway, stay. All right. So let's just move on. Let's get out of the growth plate thing. Maybe that's a jinx. Moving on to the next slide, common types of fractures. Slide number 6. We're looking at that depression fracture. A golf club to the head, injury that causes a flat bone of the skull to be depressed inward, leads to the very least massive hemorrhaging, brain swelling, death in many cases. Now there are some life-saving measures that good surgeons can perform when someone has a massive head injury like that. You're not always beat by a blunt force object. You could fall off a ladder, fall out of a tree, have a bicycle or motorcycle accident, and get a depression fracture, hit by a car. All sorts of accidents can lead to these injuries. I see things moving. All right, all sorts of accidents can lead to them, and getting medical treatment very quickly as the brain swells. This is where the surgeon actually will take a regular old drill and drill a hole somewhere in the head, put a tube in to release pressure. It's super gross and scary, but it allows for swelling to occur. You know what? We are done with the tripod. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to maybe have this view for a little while. That's just too much. Too much effery. Okay. That's not good. So this, what could have been a 22-minute lecture to finish everything up, basically just a mess. But I refuse. To start over. I refuse. Okay. So, here we are again. If you could just see what I was working with here. Anyway. All right. So the depression fracture leads to death or very serious injury of the brain, your cranium. The next one is super common. The next one is much less devastating. The next one is what many of you who have broken bones in the past have faced. It's called a greenstick fracture. And you know how living sticks, branches, twigs, if you were to try to take one off of a living tree that's nice and green and healthy with leaves and stuff, they bend. They don't just snap, they bend, and you can bend them really, really far. They don't just break in half. A greenstick fracture is a fracture of the bone, a crack in the bone, that has reacted in the same manner that a green stick would react to the same forces. So if you take a bone, and living bone is elastic, you've heard me say it and I'll say it again. Living bone is elastic. If you bend it, it will bend. And when it does break, the apex, the top end, will oftentimes fracture, but the bottom, the inside of the bend, may stay together. Just like a green stick would. You crack it eventually, that top part breaks open, but it's still connected by, living bark and the parenchyma and the phloem underneath the bark. So your bones act in the same way. A greenstick fracture has taken less force than would cause, a complete simple fracture or a terrible compound fracture. But a greenstick fracture is super common, and especially in young folks. The younger you are, the more flexible and elastic your bones are, and the more likely they are to stay together given the same amount of forces applied to older, more porous, or brittle bones found in full adults, or especially in geriatrics, or someone in a position such as myself, non-weight bearing. You lose some bone density and bones become brittle. And that's what leads us to our next slide, which to me is me, well, part of me. If you advance to slide number 7, you're looking at my broken femur. That's my right leg, X-ray with the internal fixation in it. Still have it. That's all hardware I carry around with me inside my leg. This was a result of some blunt force trauma sustained, in a situation that I did not plan for or wanted to participate in, but it happened anyway. Things like that in life occur. They're terrible. And the leg, my leg was broken in 3 places. There in the upper ramus of the femur, the long part where you see the longer tube, that was cracked, a simple fracture there, with the screw going through it, holding the screw in place and holding the bone together. And then the femoral neck that connects the long part of the bone to your, it makes your hip joint. That femoral neck was broken, and the trochanter, a rough bony prominence found on the outside, you can feel on your hip bone. That bone that's sticking out is your trochanter. It's a rough prominence for ligament attachment, and that was broken off the outside. So, it was broken into 4 pieces and screwed together, pinned together, and now, would function as a regular weight-bearing normal leg if I were, one of the regular people that still walk around. But I don't. But it's there. So that's a neat little personal shot of Mr. Miller there. Good stuff. All right. So then we move on to some sort of review, the developmental aspects that I had discussed with you in probably in the second lecture of anthropology, of how the skeleton changes over time. And this one is just a quick overview and having it in bulleted points of how your skeleton matures at certain growth stages in life. So we start at basically your skeleton is done losing bones and fusing bones and growing in length or putting on any mass or density by the age of 25. Once you're 25, your skeleton is complete. You have lost all of your deciduous teeth, your baby teeth. Your wisdom teeth have erupted and perhaps have been removed or are normal. All of your fissures, sutures along your flat bones of your skull have completely ossified. All of your growth plates, your epiphysial unions, have ossified. You are done in terms of improving. At that point, at 25, sorry folks, that's when you start to either have to maintain or slowly, in some cases more rapidly, degrade. So, in old age, bone resorption is what predominates after 25. And that rate of resorption increases the older the person gets. And these are observable indicators of age when you're looking at bones as evidence. the density of bone, the percentage of calcium phosphorus versus cartilaginous tissue, is an age determinant. And the osteoporotic process, your body using the calcium within your bones stored in the mineral sink function of your bone, using that for nervous impulse firing, starts to break down, erode, if you will, your skeleton. It starts to lose density. And there is one gene I like to throw in here, the genetics of aging. There is one gene that it codes for your vitamin D docking capability of getting calcium to stay in your skeleton. This gene is variable in terms of how long it stays active. By most folks, it's turned off by 25. Some even earlier, and there are some genetic disorders that prevent this gene from even working. And that's what one of the little fellas on that ad you might see on TV all the time, with the little tiny cute kids in wheelchairs for some hospital. One little fella's got issue with that genetic anomaly where that gene never turned on. So, osteoporosis as a toddler is unfortunately the result. But that's where I discussed with you previously about getting enough calcium and vitamin D while you were still young and vibrant to get the greatest density you possibly can have, because when that light switch goes off, and it will, whenever it does, you're pretty much done in terms of ability to bulk up your skeleton and maintain healthy, strong bones that you could as you were a younger individual. All right. Oh gosh. So now to introduce the bones of the axial skeleton. We're on the next slide. It's entitled Axial Skeleton. And you are hopefully already familiar. The axial skeleton are the main bones you absolutely cannot live without. They make up the brains of the cranium and the craniofacial bones, your vertebral column, and your bony thorax, your rib cage. These are your main bones that protect all of your absolute vital, can't live without organs, and their primary function is protection. Right? Primary is protection, secondary is support. Your appendicular skeleton, on the other hand, is not so much for protection, but for locomotion, ambulatory response, moving around, moving your hands, arms, legs, feet. That's your appendicular. But your axial skeleton is all protection of your brain, your vision, your respiratory, your cardiopulmonary, liver, all of your other major organs protected by spinal cord, left that one out, by your axial skeletal bones. Skull, vertebral column, bony thorax, axial skeleton. Okay? And then I will be giving you another handout, like another printable option of skull bones, cranial and cranial facial bones. Bones that I want you to get in your head. There's just a few that I think are worth mentioning. The main ones, those that make up your orbits and your nasal cavity and your sphenoid in there, and your upper and lower jaw, and all of the flat bones of your cranium. So we split the skull up into cranial and facial. Cranial and facial, obvious. And we'll look at those bones specifically hereafter. They craniofacial bones, your facial bones, allow for communication. Many organisms do a lot of visual communication. No need to speak or even make a voice or a sound. We are able to make all sorts of expressions, and you can tell if somebody's happy or angry or tired or bored or whatever, just simply by the musculature of the soft tissue that connects to our facial bones, we have expressions for communication. We also need appropriate shaped and aligned and configured bones for mastication. We got to be able to chew stuff. Teeth are bones. That's an important aspect of your facial bones. You got to be able to eat to live, and your skeleton plays a big role in that. You have to be able to breathe to live. I'm just changing the angle of this because it seems like it's getting sunned out. God bless it. This has just been a mess. I'm sorry. It's been a freaking mess. Anyway, so the facial bones allow for our sensory perception, allows for our auditory perception, our visual perception, our respiration, our expressions, our mastication, eating, swallowing, all of that stuff that's absolutely essential for life and communication, which is part of life, all carried out by facial bones. All right. The next slide is the handout that I would give you. I didn't know this was even in here, so maybe I won't give you that handout because you got it on the slide. We'll look at animals in the woods. We'll look at these specific bones that are labeled on this skull anterior view. Anterior is the frontal view, as opposed to the skull lateral view. Skull anterior view, you're looking at it from the front on. So I'll go over each of these specific bones and function of each of them and their forensic value in the next lecture. I think after this 22-minute just train wreck of a lecture, we'll leave it at this point. And we'll move on. When things are put together more fluidly, and I get a better tripod. All right. So don't lose any sleep over it. We'll talk soon.